So, good morning. Good morning to Paul. Good morning to Amy. I think it was quite amazing that you actually had your Shakespeare debut on stage today. That was great. It's good fun. It was a palate cleanser, or rather a brain cleanser, as we learned yesterday. Today we're going to talk about architecture and food, and it's been a real fat challenge. And I have to say, honestly, I don't know what's going to come out of it, but we're going to make a kind of interview session with Paul and Amy. I am a practicing architect, and I worked for more than 25 years, and I use my skills to translate the dreams and needs that are conveyed to me by the clients into physical form. So this is what I do. So in order to do that, it starts by programming. And before I can program, I need to understand the problem and listen to the client. Listen to what is his needs. What is it you want? You want 2 doors, or how many kids do you have? How many rooms do they need? You know, all these kind of questions. So to get more of an understanding of what to draw and how to put all that together in a 3-dimensional form. So I see myself as I have a role of solving problems, and that's right, I'm a pragmatic person, because architecture is an art form, but it's also a practical art form. We say in Danish, brugskunst, and the Danes in the room will know what I mean. It's not a free art form. It's not a volatile art form. It's not like the meal where you eat and whoops, it's gone. And that's why you guys can spend so many hours with the brilliant minds of all over the world discussing the syntax of the rhetoric of how to explain the qualities of wine, which for me is like so nerdy, but probably very important. And we should afford that. We should afford to have that kind of nerdiness, but we also need the pragmatic side. And I was saying to Paul yesterday, but why don't they use all their forces and minds and brains and knowledge together by solving another pretty big food problem? Is it 800 million undernourished people in the world? Now take that on. And if you can solve that, then we're talking, you know. But still, okay, I respect it, of course. It's very important. Sorry for dissing you for this early in the morning. It's not my plan, really. But I'm just amazed because I was jealous with you, really. I wanted the same amount of research to go into describing what architectural quality is. Architecture is a long-term art form. We have a lot of control of the processes, and we need to adjust the expectations of the user and the client very carefully before we actually do the design. Because if we get it wrong, it's pretty disastrous, and everyone is looking at that disgusting building for 50 to 100 years. And we also just have this world now for loan, because we are actually working for future generations, and we are creating the cities for the future generations. So we have a kind of a heavy responsibility on our shoulders, and we have to be cool and daring about it, not lose the artistic side completely, but also be very pragmatic and functional, of course, and also give extra added value to the people who live in our cities and in our buildings. It's important that happiness should be around. Okay, so in this session, we'll try and work from the assumption that the world has this problem. So I learned from my preparations from Paul that a large part of the population today is suffering from a word he calls gastroanomie. I think it's about right way to pronounce it, which I understand means that these people, they know very little about where the food comes from, and that they're really very disconnected to nature. And their notion of food is related to a kind of industrialized or technological world. And so let's assume here that we want tomorrow's architecture to fight this development and create some spaces and places which will teach people about taste and be aware of what and how they eat in order to become qualified diners. So that's really what we're trying to do today. Not a big job, but we'll see if we get there. Okay, so to make this change, the architect must first fully understand and use the use and psychology of this space that should be created. So what's better than to ask a couple of experts here? So all architects will start with this program, and later today I'll try in the second session to do some programming directly on stage. And it's normally written out from interviews, so the form here will be an interview, and written out from research, so on exactly what to put together and to create something or a three-dimensional space and form that was successful. So the right answer, the architecture solution, will therefore be deeply rooted in asking the right questions. And with Paul and Amy here, I'll try to conduct a conversation and series of questions in order to get closer to the answers of the perfect learning space for taste. The perfect place for gastronomy or taste to avoid further gastronomy. Later, we will engage with you guys. You saw you had a little colored piece of paper on your seat. Please don't throw it to the floor, keep it. You'll need it a little later. And you'll help us do this programming and helping me understand what's important when creating the perfect space for learning about taste. The images you see here in the back is images from around the world, and they're showing examples of places and spaces where we cultivate and produce, distribute, buy and eat food. And they're all physical spaces. It's all architecture, or landscape architecture, and cultural landscapes. These all need a program. There's always been a plan involved, some drawings, some physical ideas about how to create these spaces and this landscape. And sometimes with architects, sometimes without architects and planners. So some are very carefully aesthetically planned, and some are purely just vernacular or merely vernacular cultural landscapes formed by climate and locals to produce, cook, or eat food. So they will be just going around in the back for your information and your inspiration, because you're going to get at work later, perhaps. And there are many images, but yet they're only a fraction of examples of how big an influence and impact the subject of food has on our physical world, of our physical framework and surroundings, and vice versa. So as you talk a lot about senses, obviously, we have a saying in architecture, which is what we sense, we remember. Yesterday I learned that's not the case, in fact. But anyways, that's what we say. I should go back to my world and explain to them that's not exactly true. Some rooms, and if I think about it, some spaces and rooms make, of course, a larger impression on you forever than others. I certainly have a couple of favorites I remember clearly. But what we remember, we learn. And I'm going to use this little bit of common sense evidence to get closer to what to do. Besides the production and procurement of food, which forever influenced the aesthetics and planning of our land and buildings, there are other interesting overlaps between food and architecture. For example, you could think about the practical level, which involves skills. Both sides involve skills and craftsmanship, the notion of planning, designing the building or the meal or the recipe. It's really the same process. And understanding this delivery lines of raw materials that should go to the site or be brought to the kitchen. There's also the order of putting the food or the ingredients or the building materials together, which is very important. You have to pour the concrete before you lay the brick, obviously. Like, now I don't know a lot of recipes, but you have to put the butter on before you add the egg, I guess. These are the order of things, which is a skill, obviously, and something you have to learn. Of course, the aesthetic level, the need for presentation, the pleasing of the eye, the visual, and which involves also an author or an artist or a designer or a form giver, which we say in Danish, which is actually the best word for explaining what we do. We give form with an artistic intent. So we can come back to that later, perhaps. The cook and the architects are both giving form, that's for sure. So let's start the interview to open up the subject a little bit more and learn more about the relation between food and our surroundings. And there might be none. We know the parallels and the overlaps, or some of them, but let's see. So I'd like to start by asking you a couple of questions, Paul.
Sure.
It will be about food perception and architecture. It's a big question. But Paul, when we eat and when we taste our food, what would you say happens in the mind?
In the mind. Well, you've heard already in the last two sessions that in many respects, our experience of architecture and food is in the mind. Of course, it's driven by what comes into the mind, but it's integrated and perceived in the mind. So just let me give you two quick examples. Chili pepper. Some people love hot pepper, some people don't. As far as you know, your brain is getting the same signal, whether you like chili pepper or not. It's the interpretation that's occurring in the mind. Interestingly, people who love chili pepper do not like it in their eye. So it's a very specific conversion here. That's this sensation coming from their mouth reverses from being very unpleasant, which it is for infants and for people who haven't had it before, to very pleasant. Another example would be that imagination is so important in both architecture and food. So people who are anosmic, who cannot smell, but who have had a life of smelling, when they eat a food that they can't smell anymore, so it doesn't have much flavor, they can imagine the flavor to some degree, and that helps them have the experience.
Okay, that's interesting. So do you think that our perception of the food we eat will change depending on where we eat it?
I think there's no doubt that where the situation of eating affects our experience. Charles Spence, a number of people have looked at this. Just let me give you one example. There's a very upscale French haute cuisine dish called quenelle de brochet. It's pike, the freshwater fish pike, poached in a very light, very subtly tasted thing. I believe it was served in a cafeteria. People would say, this is tasteless. This is not good food. But in a restaurant where you're expecting something subtle and delicious, you can actually say, you can be attending to that and realize that it's very delicate. So that's just one example of this.
Okay, thank you. And so Amy, about this overlap of food and architecture I talked about, we know that food and architecture have these several things in common, and experiencing architecture is much like experiencing food. This perception of architecture is much about multisensory awareness and attention. For example, sensing the place, form, order, climate, smell, sounds, materiality, etc., and atmosphere in this three-dimensional space. And together, the body is perceiving this universe in one, you could say, in a holistic way. Once you enter, you get all these sensations, and it's much like experiencing food. And we know that often we don't notice all what's going on when we walk in these architectural spaces. It takes some kind of ability to see or be aware. But what about food and tasting? I mean, are we good at engaging enough with all our senses when we eat?
Okay, so that's a really interesting set of questions, and so I think the first thing I want to say is that to reinforce what the two Davids, David Squared from yesterday said, the anthropological approach is very much that context matters so much when you want to experience anything, and certainly when the question of taste, it's certainly true that the context makes a difference. So as Paul pointed out, the context of the quenelle, which is, a sort of force meat of a fish called of pike and stuff, and it's served in a very particular way. If it's in that context in an haute cuisine restaurant, like on that side of the table, you might, because of all the accoutrements that are there, you might have a heightened sense of, wow, I'm in an environment where this is a very fancy and a unique environment, and I'm eating this food, and it must also sort of be reinforced by this sort of fanciness. Whereas there's a version of the quenelle that's made in the Jewish tradition from Eastern Europe, which is called gefilte fish. And gefilte fish is not that different from a quenelle, but the context within which it's eaten is a very different context, and your sense of it is very much related to a certain holiday tradition and a certain religion, and you eat it with horseradish rather than with a fine cream sauce. So the context within which you're operating and having that sensory experience is so different that the very way in which you understand or appreciate it could vary greatly just because of context. But the other thing that I think that, what anthropologists think a lot about in terms of context is that your very way in which you are trained culturally to pay attention to your senses varies greatly. So as an American, I might pay attention to my meal in a very different way than you do as a Dane because of all these subtle cues that you have been, in a sense, socialized into versus what I've been socialized into. So I think that in that sense, it's probably the same case with a building. You might have an understanding of how to operate in a building because you've been, like if you are from a Catholic tradition and you've been to certain kinds of churches your whole life, you understand what to do when you walk into that building, like why you sit on one side or the other, or why you kneel, and when you don't. Whereas if you don't come from that tradition, you don't understand the cues that the building is giving you or the properties of the building.
No, that's right. But you once said to me that there is a need for, there's a need for a necessary sensory engagement when we eat. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Does it matter at all which state of mind we're in when we engage with food? Is it in, do you,
Yeah.
or maybe in order to learn and understand and be more aware, you have to have your senses open or something like that?
Well, I am very interested in the idea that theoretically, right, we have the taste buds and we have the retronasal olfaction is always happening if our body is right for that. So we're always sensing and tasting our food, but are we paying attention to it when it's happening? And I think that it's sort of a fascinating question. And there are moments in a day where you might be eating something without any regard to what you're eating. And you might be talking while you're eating. You might have not actually, you might have tasted it, your body might have tasted it, but but you might not have actually paid any attention to that.
So there's an unconscious level of experience going on while we are, because we're doing many things when we eat, rather not just filling the mouth, but also engaging, and a lot of other things is going on. But when you look at this table, say this is quite interesting. So when you said just look at this romantic, Paul is in the romantic section, you're in the modernist section. So you're saying something interesting for me here. When we have this set of dishes, this table, then we're anticipating a kind of modern take on the food, perhaps? And when we're here, we are seeing some classical French dish. Is that what it does to us? And how can we, I'll start with that question. Have you got comments on that? Do you think that when you walk into a restaurant, you see this, then you're anticipating, okay, we will not get a classical French dish here, but here I would be very amazed if I had some René Redzepi smoky thing with the teapots that came in yesterday with little trains hidden inside, choo-choo trains.
So, I think Paul can definitely answer this question too, but I would say that that there are many ways in which our contexts are shaping our sensory perceptions all the time. And if you have a preconceived notion, so for me, that context is not romantic. That context is about fanciness or sophistication.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm a different kind of a romantic, I don't know. So my cues, especially I would really like the birds in the front, the quails maybe. To me, that really evokes a certain moment in history and an idea of what is a fancy meal and what you need. So I do think that if I was sitting over there, I would imagine that the food I was going to be served was going to reinforce that already preconceived contextual notion of fanciness. Yes.
What do you think, Paul, about that?
Well, I think that expectation plays an enormous role in what we eat. And if we're in a place that we don't expect to get good food, and we really get good food, that's in a way the greatest pleasure of all. Because when you go into a restaurant that you expect to be good and it's good, well, that's great. But when you go into a place, maybe a little neighborhood ethnic restaurant, and the food is wonderful, you're not prepared for that excitement. And that excitements are greater when they're surprised. There's nothing better than a positive surprise, I would say so. And nothing worse than a negative one, I've
So there is an issue of preparation of the mind towards experience of the meal via the physical surroundings. So we can add those two. We can actually make a connection between the room, the space, and what we're anticipating to eat. That's an interesting thing to establish.